Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you very much for finding me. And if you're new here to my ramblings, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them either inside or outside or not at all. I am a low fuss, low maintenance kind of guy and my orchids need to be the same. So if that sounds like your kettle of fish, hit subscribe. I post every Friday and I am a complete amateur. But today, some successes, I feel. It is late winter, literally the last few days of winter in Australia, and one of the orchid types that starts to burst forth at this time of year, depending where you are in the country, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, is all the native Australian dendrobiums. Now look at this one. I won't tell you what it is just yet because this is the whole point of my ramble. I've got 3 Australian dendrobiums here and they all tell a story and we're going to hear it today. So plant lovers, what I wanted to talk about was really Dendrobium kingianum, which is this orchid here. You see it's got its buds haven't quite opened. This spike has opened. Now I've made lots of films about Dendrobium speciosum, Dendrobium delicatum and Dendrobium kingianum back in the glory days of my low res videos. So do have a look at those. I'll link them above and below. So we won't necessarily go into an in-depth care video about Dendrobium kingianum. But I wanted to show you these two because they are essentially the same plant, which is extraordinary. And I'll show you just the size of this one in a minute. So today, plant lovers, we're going to look at Dendrobium kingianum in its dwarf compact form and Dendrobium kingianum in its standard form, which is, as you can see, an epic plant. So yes, such variation, and you see a lot of Dendrobium kingianums and hybrids and cultivars thereof, particularly now at this time of year when they're all in bloom, and just the variety of colour and form and size of the plant and also the flower itself is just remarkable. So I have 2 extreme examples, so I thought let's have a look, and as this is a new orchid for me and it's so pretty, we should take a bit of time about it. But anyway, you know I like to start at the beginning. Let's firstly talk about Dendrobium kingianum. Now, strangely enough, it was named after Mr. King, who found the first specimens on the east coast of Australia in the 19th century. And let's look at this book, which I've looked at before. It's called Orchids at Kew by Joyce Stewart. Now, unfortunately, I got this in a second-hand bookshop for next to nothing. It's out of print. It's incredibly expensive to find. I hate to tell you that, but anyway, a very interesting book. The thing is too, of course, orchid narratives change because science is galloping apace with the naming of orchids particularly, but nonetheless, the care information is pretty consistent. But I wanted to read out what Joyce says about Dendrobium kingianums. Now, she says Dendrobium kingianum is another lithophyte which grows on cliff faces where its roots become entangled in mats of moss and ferns. Now, doesn't that sound fabulous? And if we look at this form here, you can see quite clearly how this could very easily form a dense mat of plant. Now, I will tell you what this one is. It is Dendrobium kingianum and it's a cultivar called Lauren. So we can assume that Lauren is a dwarf compact form, but let's go back to the other Bible of Australian orchids and see what that has to say about Dendrobium kingianum. So, Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols. Again, an amazing book. I got this in a second-hand bookshop and unfortunately it's out of print and quite expensive, but you never know. I found this in a junk shop for next to nothing. You might. But let's see what this book, written in the 50s, says about Dendrobium kingianum. Mr. Nichols says, grows exclusively and usually in extensive mats on cliff faces or in rock crevices and is often remarkably abundant in the vicinity of waterfalls. The orchid forms young plants from the buds at the apex of the pseudobulb, which when mature fall to the ground and establish themselves independently. Now, the other interesting thing he does mention is that there is dwarf forms, and he says that the pseudobulbs are comparatively stout in dwarf forms and slender in others. So there we go. It's an environmental thing. Now, if you're growing in opportunistic little spots on rock faces or in nooks thereof, so when they say lithophyte, Generally, what that means is that the orchids are growing in crevices in the rock where things like moss and leaf litter have built up. So there's a little bit of medium in these nooks. It's not clinging to the rock necessarily. So, you know, bear that in mind, but quite a contained space. And then the orchid, once it sort of fills that spot, will, as was described, form a mat as it starts to produce baby plants, and they fall off and it spreads and it develops this tangled mat of orchid. So you can imagine that an orchid that is specialized in growing in that spot is going to be quite small, quite stout, and these pseudobulbs are really quite bulbous because orchids are kind of a succulent. They store water in their pseudobulbs or stems. So this one is ideally suited for that kind of environment. So you can quite imagine why. There's a whole form of Dendrobium kingianum that are quite short and quite thick. However, there are also forms like this one, which is Dendrobium kingianum, which have very tall, slender canes, which you can see, and very long, you see that bobbing in the wind, very long flower spikes with a stronger color flower. But you can also imagine that that, quite simply, evolved in a nook that was just a little different from its rocky friends. So this may have been growing in a slightly different spot with maybe deeper soil and more capacity to grow in a different manner. So there are lots of different forms of Dendrobium kingianum, and then they have been hybridized like there is no tomorrow in the last sort of 50 or more years. So naturally a lot of variety in form, and then mix that together with a lot of hybridization, you get amazing variety in shape, size, flower color, fragrant, not fragrant. Goodness me. The world is your oyster with Dendrobium kingianum. And I think too, for those of us, or those of you with less space, smaller or sort of dwarf form orchids are obviously a great way to go, because this orchid could quite happily stay in this pot for most of its life. When it started to literally fall off the side with its growth habit, you can just pull those keikis off, pop them on, and off you go. So this is a great orchid for those who don't have a huge amount of space. The only issue is with Dendrobium kingianum is that the flowers don't last that long, a couple of weeks, and they only flower once a year. So that is a lot of time to give to a plant which only does one thing. But I tell you what, when it does do its thing, it's beautiful. And this has such a beautiful fragrance. It's quite light and almost violety, which is charming because the inside of the flower is a little bit violet. Isn't it beautiful? So I bought this particular one about, actually probably nearly a year ago now. A fantastic nursery, which is this one here. It's called The Hanging Garden, who are specialists in Australian orchids, are unfortunately winding down their business. So they had a huge sale of a lot of their plants, and this was one of them. I just loved its form, and I think there was a picture of the flower. It wasn't in bloom when I bought it, but anyway, it's very, very charming. Quick rundown then on care, just in case you haven't watched my other video from start to finish. Essentially, Australian Dendrobiums of this type are quite drought tolerant, so you can let them dry out quite a bit. I can be very neglectful of mine, water them when I remember, not water them when I don't remember. So, however, a lot of mine are outside in the elements, so they do get rained on, so they can sort of manage with that. And in summer, I do hose them down and give them a good drenching, but they do frequently dry out quite considerably between each watering, and they can certainly cope with that. Not an orchid that wants to be overwatered or left very soggy for a long period of time. Dendrobium kingianum also likes the sun. It needs winter light to stimulate the flower spikes, and it can take full sun, but the leaves and the stems will get very, very burnt. You'll still get amazing blooms, but the plant form won't look so great. So you've kind of got to get that sweet spot where you're giving it afternoon dappled light, but direct morning light for at least half the day. So it can bloom for you. I think the reason most people perhaps can't bloom these is A, it does need a colder change in seasonality, and B, it does need strong, good light in winter to produce its flowers. So let's put Lauren aside, which is this amazing Dendrobium cultivar, fabulous, fabulous form of Dendrobium kingianum, and let's look at the classic form and just compare and contrast. Okay, here is my kingianum plant. So as you can see, the canes are very long and very slender on this one compared to the quite stubby and very short canes of this one. So it's kind of hard to believe that they're forms of the same plant, isn't it? Amazing. But you will see the very, very, very close similarity between the flowers. I'll come and show you those together. Now, Dendrobium kingianum, extremely tough, very easy to grow here. But as you can see, perhaps you're saying, Matthew, not seeing many flowers. There's a spike there. No, normally you would get a spike, sometimes two, from every cane. The thing is though, these orchids need great light, particularly winter light, as I said. And at the moment, in our rental, while we're still renovating our house, I just can't give this the optimum light that it needs to bloom. So I'm very pleased that it does flower for me. Look at that beautiful magenta flower. And there's about 4 spikes, and I actually did snap one off, which is really annoying. But really, this should be a mound of mauve blooms. And hopefully when we move and I can put it in more sun, it will. And here's the thing. In fact, the book described how new plants are produced at the apex, which is called a keiki generally. But you can see that this one is growing here, and you literally just snap them off, and there we have a whole new plant. You can see the little rootlets there. These are really tough. Now, normally with a keiki, you'd want roots that were a bit more developed, but these things are so tough. I would just shove that in a little bit of out of the bag orchid mix actually, and you will have a plant. They're very, very easy to propagate from these keikis. Now, it will produce a lot of keikis if, like this one, it's not getting enough light, but it's getting lots of water. So this one is obviously quite hydrated, and it is not in enough sunlight. And if we have a little look around, here is another keiki on the end of this cane, which we could just snap off as well. So there you go, 2 plants already. So this goes to show without light, they are just not going to bloom for you. And that is unfortunate because I'm not going to be able to give it the best light, as I said, for at least another year. Anyway, you keep blooming for me, these odd little spikes, and I shall be happy. Now, the other thing, which I haven't told you, well, I did vaguely, Dendrobium kingianum has a beautiful fragrance, absolutely beautiful. And this one, it's really light and fresh and slightly violety. It's a gorgeous spring fragrance, absolutely wonderful. They're not native to my part of Australia. They are native to the East Coast, but a bit further up from me. They can, however, and they do, thrive in Melbourne. So they can take really quite cold winter minimums. They can go down to 0 degrees centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit, even a little bit below, but they can't take frost. So if you're in a frosty environment, you will need to protect them from the frost. But if you're a similar climate to mine, then you can certainly grow these outside all year, as long as they're getting light in winter. Food-wise, you know, yeah, I give mine a slow-release fertilizer in spring, and I just sprinkle some pellets on, and I'm about to do that with all my orchids, actually, so I think I'll make a spring task video. There's many things to go through, including those of our friends that didn't make it through winter. Oh, that fragrance is beautiful. So yeah, I must say I treat these pretty mean, and I do, if I'm in the vicinity, I do give them a top-up liquid fertilize during the warmer growing seasons. And that can be either a liquid orchid-based fertilizer that's specifically aimed at orchids, or a liquid generic fertilizer for any plant. And then I also, if I'm in the vicinity, give it a tonic, which is either a seaweed-based solution or the runoff from a worm farm, which is full of wonderful things that the plant needs to thrive. So it's not a food per se, it is a tonic. So there is a difference between those two, between fertilizing and giving it a little tonic, a little cocktail at the end of a long day. Now, I've also been lucky enough to just get a new species of Australian Dendrobium. This one, look at that, isn't it gorgeous? And this is called, I think the tag is very stuck in the pot. Goodness me. Dendrobium gracilicaule, there we go. And it is a cross between limelight and green ball. Now, as you can see, the flower is very, very, very similar to kingianum, which we have here. There we are. Very, very similar. But the flowers are smaller. It has a very particular sort of pendulous form. And the canes, as you can see, I've got this in an old Indian pot because it's very top heavy in this pot. It's very, very pot bound, as you can see, which is another thing that Australian Dendrobiums love, being pot bound. They all come from those rocky nooks where it's very, very constrained. So they are not an orchid to overpot. I can't think of one that you should overpot, but anyway, this is really one that you shouldn't. It does love to be pot bound. So this is quite a hard to find species here for some unknown reason. I'm not quite sure why. Not as common as its other speciosum delicatum kingianum friends, but very, very, very beautiful. And you can see that the flowers are sort of spotted, and that's one of its nicknames or common names, spotted orchid. Quite elegant and has the similar-ish sort of family of fragrance, but it's perhaps a little muted, less springy and vibrant, more mid-tones. Very lovely though. And gracilicaule, this one, was named by a man called Baron Ferdinand von Müller, and he actually founded the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, which is an amazing botanic garden here, and which is one of the top 5 in the world actually, so there you go. And he named this in 1859, and the gracilicaule comes from gracilis in Latin, which means slender, and caulis meaning stem or shank. So slender stem, dendrobium with the slender stem. And it certainly does. But I would say Dendrobium kingianum equally as slender, but hey ho, this one got the name first. But a very pretty thing, and I'm very happy to add it to my collection. And again, I would perhaps say that this hasn't had optimum light, because you really should be getting flower spikes from the top of every cane. So yeah, I do have my work cut out finding the right spot for these, which is sunny. Now you can see that the leaves are a little bit mottled. That is just from the nursery where it has come from. Nothing sinister there, it's just literally some staining on the leaves from something that they have in their watering system, which is leaving a bit of a deposit. But anyway, nothing to be alarmed about. Very lovely. So my aim with all of these is to have a serried rank of Dendrobium kingianums and speciosums and delicatums all in bloom at the same time, which I'll be able to show you. That, plant lovers, if we're all still around, might well be in 2 years when we've moved and settled and everything's had a year of the right sunlight. So if you go down the rabbit hole of Dendrobium kingianum, you could end up with hundreds of plants, all of which have different flowers, very different shapes, and they all bloom at the same time. So you'll have a very dull collection for the rest of the time. But when they are all in bloom en masse, it is a sight to behold. And I was just at an orchid fair, and it is the season, and there was just rows and rows and rows of all of these plants with slightly different colors and forms and spots. And I did think, I think that's what I need to work towards. Anyway, I do have quite a few of these. I am not getting any more, he says. Sharp promise. However, this was a fairly recent purchase. I do think I've got enough. But I know they're very popular in the States and in Britain. And I guess it's a grand irony that they are so easy for me to grow here that I almost couldn't make a care video about it because they almost get no care from me. Interesting plants, interesting blooms, beautiful colors, and really tough. So there we are, plant lovers. A little update on Dendrobium kingianum, a dwarf form, and its regular form, just for your delectation. I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you have, do hit like and do hit subscribe, because I post every Friday and you can witness other similar ramblings of an amateur nature. But I do hope all is well in your world, and I look forward to seeing you next week.